He'd been on the roar place 11 days before the little girl told him, fence work, mostly, cattle when the weather allowed, 3 weeks of hard labor for a man named Amos Roar, who paid late and watched everything, and a widow named Sarah who brought water out to the fence line at noon and didn't say much beyond thank you. The child had never spoken to him at all, 3 years old, always at her mother's skirts, always watching. That evening, he was saddling up to ride back to the bunkhouse when he felt a small hand catch the edge of his poncho. Nell stood there looking up at him. She raised one hand and cupped it around her mouth the way children do when a thing is meant to be a secret. He knelt down so she could reach his ear. "He hurts mommy when you leave," she whispered. Then she went back inside like she'd said nothing at all. And the gunslinger stayed exactly where he was, one hand still on the saddle horn, doing the arithmetic on 11 nights he'd ridden away from that house at dusk. Before we begin, if this story gets under your skin the way I think it might, drop a comment and tell me about a time you knew something was wrong in a house before anybody said a word out loud. And if you believe the quiet ones deserve somebody to finally notice, subscribe and ride with us to the end. He'd been on the roar place 11 days before the little girl told him. And in those 11 days, he'd learned the shape of that ranch the way a man learns anything he works with his hands. The west fence line that never seemed to stay standing. The cattle that drifted toward water they had no business drifting toward. The barn that smelled of hay gone slightly sour because nobody had turned it in a season. It was seasonal work. 3 weeks of it. Fence and cattle and whatever else needed doing before the weather turned hard. Hired on by a man named Amos Roar, who paid late and paid short, and stood at the corner of the corral, watching every hour of labor like he suspected he was being cheated out of something. The arrangement was simple enough. Dala 8 hours on the property, and at dusk, the gunslinger saddled up and rode the half-mile to a bunkhouse at the edge of the land where the hired men slept. And in 11 days, he had never once had reason to think twice about riding away when the light went. There was a widow in the house, Sarah Roar, 28 years old, the wife of Amos, dead brother, and she came out to the fence line most days around noon with a bucket of water and a tin cup, and set it down without much conversation beyond asking whether he needed anything else. She was polite, in the careful way of a person who has learned that politeness costs less than any other kind of talking. She wore her sleeves down to the wrist, even on the warm days. He'd noticed that the way a man notices 100 small things in the course of a day's work without stacking them up into anything. And he'd have gone on not stacking them if the child hadn't spoken. The child was 3, near as he could figure. Nell. She'd never said a word to him in 11 days, just watched from behind her mother's skirts or from the porch rail with the unblinking attention small children give to strangers. And he'd nodded at her a few times and gotten nothing back and thought no more about it than that. On the 11ª evening he was saddling up in the yard with the light going orange over the ridge when he felt something catch at the edge of his poncho, a small tug, and turned to find her standing there alone with her hand full of the wool. She raised her other hand and cupped it around her mouth, the way children do when a thing is meant to be a secret, and looked up at him and waited. So he knelt down in the dirt so she could reach his ear, and Nell Roar leaned in close and whispered 11 words that changed the whole shape of the last 11 days. "It hurts mommy when you leave." Then she let go of his poncho and turned and walked back toward the house unhurried the way a child walks when she said the thing she came to say and the door shut behind her. And the gunslinger stayed exactly where he was, with one hand still on the saddle horn, doing arithmetic he did not want to do. 11 days, 11 evenings of riding out at dusk, with the light going and the work done, and his mind on nothing heavier than tomorrow's fence line. 11 nights he had left that house behind him without once turning around. It didn't ride to the bunkhouse that night. It rode out past the ridge until the house was gone from view. Then swung wide through the cottonwoods along the creek and came back around on foot and sat down in the dark at the tree and where he could see the lit windows without being seen himself. He stayed there better than those hours, and what he saw wasn't violence and wasn't shouting and wasn't anything a man could ride into town and report. It was a woman moving through a lit kitchen doing chores at an hour when the work should have been done and the lamp should have been out. It was Amos Roar sitting in a chair by the window, not reading, not eating, not doing anything at all except watching her do it. Once she stopped and stood still with both hands flat on the table for a long moment, and Amos said something the gunslinger couldn't hear from that distance, and she picked up the cloth again and kept going. That was all. That was the whole of it, and it told him more than a scream would have. In the morning, Amos Rohr was exactly the man he'd been for 11 days, which was somehow worse for having seen the night before it. He came out to the corral with coffee he didn't offer to share, and talked about the weather and the price of beef, and unprompted about his brother. Caleb had been a good man, Amos said, and a careless one, and the two things together had cost him. Fell off a horse he'd ridden 300 times on ground he knew better than his own hands and left behind a wife and a baby girl and not much else besides ing said but a man does what family requires of him and so he'd taken them both in and kept a roof over them these 14 months and if the town of Bitterroot Bend thought well of him for it well he'd never asked anybody to the gunslinger asked in the flat and incurious tone of a hired hand making conversation how the property had come to Amos rather than to the widow. Will Amos said and smiled around the rim of his cup. Caleb wrote it years back before he ever met her. Never got around to changing it. Everything to me, he shrugged. Law is the law. He could have put them off the place the week we buried him. Ask anyone in town what I did instead. There it was, laid out plain and unashamed in a corral at 7 in the morning. A woman with no claim to the roof over her head, no money of her own, a 3-year-old daughter, and a whole town that thought the man holding all of it was a saint for allowing her to stay. She couldn't leave because there was nowhere to go and nothing to go with. She couldn't speak because the only people who'd hear her were the same people who'd been telling her for 14 months how lucky she was. The gunslinger drank his own coffee and said nothing and understood exactly why a woman would wear her sleeves down to the wrist in warm weather and answer every question with the same 3 careful words. At noon she came out to the fence line with the bucket the way she always did and he took the cup she offered and asked her one question. Quiet without looking up from the wire he was working. "You sleep all right out here, ma'am?" Sarah Rohr said she slept fine. She said the country was quiet and the nights were cool and she'd never had any trouble sleeping in her life. She said all of it steadily and pleasantly and without a single pause. The way a person says a thing they have said many times before, and while she said it, her hands around the bucket handle shook hard enough that the water moved in it, and she saw him see it, and she picked the bucket up and went back to the house without another word. He worked the rest of that day with his mind somewhere else entirely. And it was near dark when he went into the barn to hang the wire cutters on their nail and stopped because he was looking at something he'd walked past 11 days running without ever once looking at properly. Caleb Rohr's saddle, still hanging on the far wall where somebody had put it 14 months ago, and nobody had touched it since, gone stiff and pale with dust. The gunslinger crossed the barn and turned the cinch strap over in his hands, and found underneath 14 months of fraying and weather, a line where the leather had parted, an edge far too clean to have ever torn on its own. He put the saddle back on its nail exactly as he'd found it, dust and all, and told nobody. That was the first decision he made and the hardest one because everything in him wanted to walk into that house and put the strap on the kitchen table in front of Amos Rohr and watch what happened to the man's face. But a cut cinch on a 14-month-old saddle proved nothing on its own except that leather had parted, and any man with a lawyer or a friendly word from the sheriff could call it where and be believed. And if he showed his hand now, the saddle would be in a fire by morning, and Sarah Rohr would be alone in that house with a man who knew somebody was looking. So he hung it back up and went to his bunk and lay awake most of the night. And in the morning, he went back to work on the fence like a hired hand with nothing on his mind but wire. The fence was the second thing. He'd been repairing the west line off and on for 11 days without giving it much thought because fences fall down and men fix them and that's the whole of ranching. But once a man starts looking properly at a place, he starts noticing what doesn't sit right. The west line came down more often than any fence had business coming down. Not storm damage, not cattle pressure. Posts pulled and set back crooked. Wire rerun by somebody in a hurry. The same 40-yard stretch over and over, while the rest of the property line stood solid for years at a stretch. And on the far side of it, in the low ground where the creek pulled before it turned south, he counted 11 head of cattle drinking that didn't carry the Rohr brand at all. He watched them a while and understood he was looking at something worth money. Water in that country was worth more than grass and considerably more than beef. And the neighboring outfit whose cattle drank freely on another man's land either had an arrangement or was stealing. And either way, somebody was profiting, and it wasn't the widow in the house. The days after that were slow and careful. He kept his hours, kept his mouth shut, and let Sarah Roar come to him in her own time, which she did in pieces over the better part of a week. Never all at once, never anything that could be called a confession, just fragments dropped at the fence line at noon, while she looked at the horizon instead of at him. That Caleb had been a kind man and a happy one. That the 14 months since had a shape to them she couldn't describe to anybody. That she'd stopped going into town because of the way people said how good Amos was to her and how she was expected to agree and how she always did. It is a particular kind of cruelty that never leaves a mark anybody can point at and a particular kind of prison that looks from the outside like a favor. Have you ever watched somebody get praised for their generosity while the person on the receiving end of it counted the hours until daylight? Tell me below. Never judge because half of us have sat at a table with a man like Amos Roar and never once thought to ask the woman across from him whether she was all right. It was the child who broke it open. And she did it without knowing she'd done anything at all. Mill was under the kitchen table with a wooden horse the afternoon it happened. And she said in the offhand way of a 3-year-old repeating something she'd said many times before that Uncle Amos came back by himself that morning. Sarah standing at the basin said gently that no, sweetheart. Uncle Amos came with the men who brought the news about Daddy. And Nell said, no, he didn't. He came back first all alone and went in the barn a long time. And then he went away again. And then the man came. Sarah's hand stopped in the water. She said the same thing she'd apparently said a dozen times over 14 months, that Nell had been very small and small children mixed things up, and it was all right. And the gunslinger, standing in the doorway with a coil of wire over his shoulder, asked one question in a voice he kept as light as he could make it. He asked what time the men had come with the news. Sarah said mid-morning. Around 10, she thought, maybe closer to 11 because she'd been putting the wash out. And the gunslinger stood there in the doorway with the arithmetic running plain and cold behind his eyes. Because if Amos Roar had come back to that house alone, gone into that barn, and left again before anybody in the county knew Caleb Roar was dead, then Amos Roar had known something that morning that nobody had told him. He went into Bitterroot Bend on the Saturday under the excuse of buying wire and stopped in at the county clerk's office where a boardman named Pettibone confirmed for him without much interest that Judge Merrick rode the circuit through Bitterroot Bend on a fixed schedule, same as he'd done 9 years running, and that the next session opened in 6 days' time. 6 days. The gunslinger's own hire ran out in 8. He bought his wire and rode back out to the property doing sums of a different kind. And by the time he reached the gate, he'd decided that whatever else happened, Sarah Roar and that child were not going to spend another 6 nights in that house while he sat in a bunkhouse a half-mile off, pretending he didn't know what happened after dark. He arranged it carefully and quietly. There was a widow in town named Edibas who'd known Sarah's mother and a spare room, and no particular love for Amos Roar, and it took the gunslinger less than an hour to have it settled. Sarah and Nell would come in for a few nights on the honest enough excuse that the child needed seeing to by the town doctor before the weather turned. Sarah agreed to it the way a person agrees to something they've wanted badly and stopped believing was possible quickly and without questions and started putting a small bag together that same evening. Amos Roar came out of the house before she'd finished. And he'd clearly heard enough of it through the wall to have worked out the rest. And for the first time in 19 days, the gunslinger saw the man's face without the pleasant arrangement he wore for the town on it. He didn't shout, he said in a voice as flat and reasonable as a bill of sale. That the hired hand who involved himself in family business was a hired hand no longer, and that he wanted him off the property inside the hour, and that if he came back through the gate for any reason at all, it would be trespass, and the sheriff would be told so. And every word of it was true. That was the thing that stopped the gunslinger cold in the yard with his hand on the saddle. Not the threat, but the law standing squarely behind it. The house was Amos. The land was Amos. The gate, the barn, the saddle hanging in it, the woman standing in the doorway with a half-packed bag and her face gone white. All of it was his legally, and there wasn't a single thing about that a stranger could argue with. He wrote off the ROP place inside the hour because there wasn't any other choice available to a man standing on another man's land with the law behind the other man. And the last thing he saw through the gate was Sarah Rohr standing on the porch with the half-packed bag still in her hand and Amos taking it out of it. Neil was at the window. She didn't wave. She just watched him go the way she'd watched him go 11 nights running. And something about the ordinariness of it. The child's total lack of surprise at another grown man riding away from that house at dusk, sat in his chest the whole half-mile to the bunkhouse, and all through the night after. They came into town the next day anyway, but not the way he'd arranged it. Amos brought them himself in the wagon on a Sunday when the whole of Bitterroot Bend was on the street, and he handed Sarah down from the seat and carried the child on his own shoulder past the mercantile and the church steps like a man modeling a portrait of himself. Alf the town said good morning to him. 2 women stopped to tell Sarah how fortunate she was, and Sarah agreed quietly because there wasn't another answer available to her in the middle of a street full of people who'd already decided the shape of the story. The gunslinger watched the whole performance from the shade outside the livery and understood that Amos hadn't come to town to buy anything. It had come to be seen and to make sure Sarah was seen agreeing with him and to close the door on the arrangement with Ibas before it ever opened. So he stopped trying to move Sarah out of that house and started working on the only thing that could actually get her out of it permanently, which was proof. He rode south the next morning to the Kessler outfit, whose brand he'd counted on once hit drinking Rohr water, and he didn't approach it sideways. He rode up to the main house, introduced himself as a man who'd worked the Rohr West line, and asked plainly whether they had an arrangement for that water, or whether their cattle had simply wandered. Old man Kessler was insulted by the suggestion and said so at length, and then he went into the house and came back out with a paper to prove it. A signed side agreement granting the Kessler outfit water access across the Rohr West line for a term of 5 years at a price that was more than fair, made out in a clear hand and signed at the bottom by Amos Rohr. The gunslinger looked at the date at the top of that page for a long moment. It was written 4 months before Caleb Rohr fell off a horse he'd ridden 300 times. Kessler let him copy it out word for word into his own notebook. That this and terms and all, still put out at the implication that his cattle might be trespassing. And it wasn't until the gunslinger was 2 millas back up the road toward Bitterroot Bend that the whole thing finally assembled itself into one shape. Caleb Rohr hadn't owned that land. His brother had on paper by will since years before either of them had married. But Caleb had lived on it, worked it, walked that west line, and would have noticed once a head of another man's cattle drinking his creek and a fence that came down 40 yards at a time in the same place over and over. He'd have asked about it, and when he asked, he'd have learned that his own brother had been quietly selling off water rights on the property they both depended on, and pocketing the money. 4 months and counting. A cut-cinch strap. A brother who came back to the house alone before anyone knew. A fence that never stayed standing because it was being taken down deliberately over and over to let paid-for cattle through. It was still turning it over when the 3 riders came out of the dark at the bend by the creek crossing and put a horse across the road in front of him. They were Amos, Min. 2 he knew from the corral and 1 he didn't. And they didn't announce anything or make any speeches. The first one came in swinging a length of fence wire, and the gunslinger took it across the forearm, getting under it. Came up inside the man's reach and put him off his horse into the shallow water. And the second one caught him a solid blow across the shoulders that nearly finished the argument right there. It was close and ugly and quick, the way real fights are. And it ended with 2 of them in the creek and the third pulling back out of range and thinking better of the whole enterprise. Nobody drew a gun. Nobody died. But he came out of it with a forearm swelling and a